Hello and welcome back to another episode of Indistinct Chatter. I'm Eliza, and before we get into today's episode, let's start with a few headlines that have dominated the news cycle this week. Tensions between the US and Iran have been escalating still, and even though we're not officially calling it a war, it's starting to look like the early stages of one. There's been aggressive rhetoric, threats toward Iranian infrastructure, and global markets are reacting more and more. Again, gas prices are still climbing. The national average has now hit the $4 mark, diesel being almost $5 a gallon. Now, I don't know about you guys, but over the weekend when we got gas, we paid $4.20 per gallon. It's insane. So when people say what's happening across seas doesn't affect us, they're wrong. They are so wrong. When energy infrastructure is threatened, it affects global oil supply, which affects gas prices, shipping costs, and eventually pretty much everything else. So, we're not just talking about your daily commute being affected. It's going to be your groceries, your rent, literally everything. That's why you should care about what's going on outside of your own country, okay? And historically, this is how escalation works. It doesn't start with a formal announcement. Instead, it builds slowly and then boom, it's happening. And we'll continue to feel those ripple effects as things continue. Shifting gears, on March 28th, there were nationwide protests under the No Kings movement. These rallies were centered around concerns of executive overreach and authoritarianism. And it's interesting to me because it's not just that people showed up, which were a lot of people, by the way, like an estimated 8 or 9 million people. But to me, what's interesting is where they showed up. Okay. A significant number of these protests took place in traditionally conservative states like Texas, Florida, and Ohio. To me, that's kind of telling, right? Like, clearly, this isn't just a one sided issue. It's not just liberals or the left or whatever. This means there is a broader level of concern that's crossing typical political lines. And honestly, I love to see it. Both ends of the spectrum are coming together and putting the country first. And that's what we're all about, right? More and more people are coming together over concerns of power, leadership, and just where things are heading. And in other news, unfortunately, it's not a first time story for this guy, but Tiger Woods was arrested on suspicion of DUI after his vehicle was found overturned near his home. His breathalyzer test reportedly came back at 0.00, so no alcohol, but authorities believe he may have been impaired due to medication. And look, regardless of the substance, I feel like this argument or this conversation comes up over and over again. And especially when it comes to celebrities or wealthier people, there is no reason, especially in 2026, to be behind the wheel while impaired. Rideshare exists, resources exist. And like I mentioned, this isn't even the first time he's been in the news about this. So, for all you golfing fans, or if you have friends who are big fans of golfing, especially if they're big fans of Tiger Woods, check in on those friends, okay? Because we don't know yet what this will mean for his participation in the Masters. Moving on now to news that you might have missed. Bank of America recently agreed to a $72.5 million settlement with survivors connected to Jeffrey Epstein. The lawsuit alleged that the bank ignored obvious red flags while doing business with him. And if you've been paying attention, this is now part of the pattern that we're seeing. JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank have already paid out hundreds of millions of dollars combined. And at this point, every major bank that did business with Epstein has paid settlements to the survivors. And yet, not a single high-level executive has been criminally charged. So, that's interesting. Corporations are paying fines and individuals just get to walk away. Another story still flying under the radar is the ongoing impact of the Department of Homeland Security shutdown. And it's important because DHS oversees TSA, disaster response through FEMA, immigration processing, cybersecurity, things that directly affect daily life and national security. So, when it's underfunded or partially shut down, workers go unpaid, services slow down, and response capabilities weaken. And at a time when global tensions are rising, it's not exactly reassuring, if you ask me. I mentioned this last week, how TSA is so short-staffed and overworked right now, and the conspiracies are getting stronger. Once they're fully formed, I'll talk about them, but they're still forming, okay? Look them up. Lastly, so you know how our 401ks are usually a mix of boring stocks and bonds? Well, the Trump administration just signed an executive order to shake that up. They are making it much easier for plan managers to put our retirement money into alternative assets, specifically private equity, but also things like crypto and real estate. So here's the deal. I'll give you the good news first. The big investment firms are telling the government that the stock market is tapped out. They argue that by letting us into private equity, which used to just be reserved for only the ultra wealthy, we could see much higher returns over 20 or 30 years. It's basically democratizing the kind of investments that Wall Street elites use to get rich. I mean, that's kind of cool, right? But the catch, okay, there are some pretty big red flags. First, there are insane fees. Private equity firms usually charge way more than a standard index fund. So we're talking like 2% off the top plus 20% of the profits. That can eat up a huge chunk of your savings over time. Second, your money is locked. Okay, so you can't just sell private equity like a regular stock. These investments are often illiquid, meaning your money might be stuck there for 7 to 10 years. And lastly, there's less transparency. These aren't public companies, so they don't have to report their numbers as clearly. It's a bit more of a black box, as they call it. So, who actually wins or who actually benefits, right? Honestly, and no surprise here, it's a massive win for Wall Street. They just got access to a $12 trillion pool of our retirement money. Okay, 12 trillion with a T, not a B anymore, a T of our retirement money to play with and collect fees on. For the average person like you and me, that's a gamble. If the investments do amazing, you might retire with a bit more, but if they tank, you're the one left holding the empty bag while the fund managers already took their cut. It's definitely something to keep an eye on, especially when your HR department starts sending out those plan update emails. And that's the news. We did it, guys. We made it through. Now let's move on to today's subject. Today is March 31st, so it's the last day of Women's History Month. Boo! And instead of doing a broad overview, I wanted to focus on something a little bit more specific, a little bit more fun, dare I say a little bit spooky. I'm going to talk about horror. Specifically, women in horror. When we talk about horror as a genre, a lot of people assume it started with men. And to be fair, one of the earliest recognized Gothic novels was written by a man, Horace Walpole, in 1764 called The Castle of Otranto. Now, normally, that's where the story would just stop, right? I mean, we've got the father of horror. Not quite, because almost immediately after that, women didn't just enter the genre, they completely took it over and they transformed it. And who might these women be, you ask? Well, first, let me introduce you to Ann Radcliffe, known as the Great Enchantress. Anne was writing in the late 1700s at a time when women weren't really encouraged to have public voices, especially not in literature that dealt with fear, suspense, or anything psychologically complex. But she became one of the most successful writers of her time. And not just successful for a woman, successful, period. Her novels, like The Mysteries of Udolpho, were bestsellers that got her some good-ass money, like a 500-pound copyright payment when the average author was lucky enough to see 10 pounds. I did a little Googling, and in today's money, in US dollars, that would have been about $150,000 to $160,000. So just for a copyright payment. That's not change, baby. And what she did was different. Okay, so instead of relying on shock, like monsters jumping out, traumatic violence, all that crap, she built tension slowly. She focused on atmosphere, on isolation, on the feeling that something is wrong, even if you can't quite explain why. And that might sound normal now. Case in point, the new show on Netflix titled Something Very Bad is Going to Happen. I mean, that's got Ann Radcliffe written all over it, right? But at the same time, it was a shift. She basically invented what we now think of as psychological horror. And here's what's interesting about that. She often explained the supernatural events in her stories as something rational by the end. So the fear wasn't about ghosts. It was about the experience of fear, the anxiety, the anticipation, the loss of control. And if that sounds like a formula for a modern day blockbuster, that's because it is. When you watch a movie like 2016's The Boy, where a haunted doll is eventually revealed to be a man living in the walls, spoiler alert, but you had 10 years, you are watching a Radcliffe story. She pioneered the explained supernatural, a technique that still keeps us glued to our seats in psychological thrillers like The Others, or even the classic Scooby-Doo mystery. But Anne's real genius was using that fear to talk about something much more grounded: the terrifying reality of being a woman in the 18th century. In what we now call the female Gothic, her heroines aren't just running from ghosts. They're running from tyrannical men, locked rooms, and a legal system that gave them zero control over their own lives. She was so influential that she sparked a literal Gothic craze. Jane Austen was so struck by her that she wrote an entire book, Northanger Abbey, just to parody the Radcliffe style. Later, the Bronte sisters took her isolated, windswept mansions and turned them into Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. Even Edgar Allan Poe and Mary Shelley built their darkest worlds on the foundation that she laid. Despite being a literary superstar, Anne was famously reclusive, rarely appearing in public. This silence kind of fueled these wild rumors that she'd gone mad or died in an asylum. Literal ghost stories about the ghost story writer. While in reality, she was just a woman who preferred her privacy, having already proved that the most powerful thing she could own was the world's imagination. Ann Radcliffe showed us that you don't need a monster under the bed to be terrified, although it still scares me. Honestly, monsters under the bed really still scare me. It freaks me out. I get goosebumps sometimes at night if I stand too long next to my bed because I just feel like something's going to grab me. Do you guys remember on Disney Channel? It was a DCOM, Don't Look Under the Bed or something like that. I had to sleep with my parents for like a month after watching that. And that was Disney. Anyway, so yeah, but she proved that you don't need that. I apparently still do to be terrified. But she proved that sometimes the scariest thing can sometimes just be like a closed door, a flickering candle, and honestly, just like the realization that your own mind is often the one playing tricks on you. So, ooh, spooky. Now, since I mentioned her, let's move on to Mary Shelley. She has a wild story. Mary Shelley didn't just, one day wake up and write Frankenstein. She was born into a very intellectual, very unconventional family. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was one of the earliest feminist philosophers, and her father, William Godwin, was a radical political thinker. She grew up surrounded by big ideas, but she also grew up surrounded by loss because her mother died just 11 days after Mary was born. She, had a complicated relationship with her father, and as a teenager, she ran away with the poet Percy Shelley, who was already married at the time. So, from the very beginning, her life was marked by instability, grief, and then obviously social judgment. But here's where her story gets legendary. Let's take it back, okay? The year is 1816. It's the year without a summer. A volcanic eruption has turned the weather into a cold, rainy mess, and Mary is stuck in a villa in Switzerland with Percy and the infamous Lord Byron. To kill the time, Byron proposes a challenge. We will each write a ghost story. While the men struggled to finish theirs, 18-year-old Mary Shelley had a waking dream. She imagined a pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside a thing he had put together, a creature brought to life by a spark of electricity. But what makes Mary a genius isn't just that she came up with a monster. She asked the question that haunts us more today than ever before, especially with AI, okay? What happens when our creations outgrow us? Spooky. When the book was published anonymously in 1818, people could not believe that a woman wrote this. Many assumed that Percy Shelley was the real author, but Mary proved them wrong. Mary Shelley basically invented science fiction by replacing magic with unhallowed arts, like electricity. Today, her modern Prometheus is the blueprint for almost every story about artificial intelligence, aka AI. When we watch Ex Machina or Westworld, we are watching Mary's warning about scientific arrogance or scientific vanity or scientific presumptions all playing out in digital form. We see her influence in the lonely, misunderstood monsters of Tim Burton's Edward Scissorhands. Ah, love that movie. She funneled her own personal grief into a story about abandonment because Frankenstein isn't just about science gone wrong, okay? It's about abandonment. It's about a parent who, creates life and then refuses to take responsibility for it. So by the age of 24, Mary Shelley was a widow, a single mother. She had lost 3 of her 4 children. She spent the rest of her life writing to support her only surviving son, essentially inventing the genre of science fiction along the way. She knew exactly what it felt like to be a creator left alone with the pieces of a broken world. Mary Shelley took the darkness of her own life and she turned it into the most enduring myth of the modern age. She showed us that the real monsters aren't the things that we build necessarily, they're the ways that we fail to love them and take responsibility for them. Then, almost a century later, we meet Shirley Jackson. And this is where horror kind of moves more into something a little bit more, I don't know, intimate. Shirley Jackson was writing in the mid 1900s. She's a wife, a mother, and someone who dealt with significant mental health struggles. And a lot of that shows up in her work. Her horror isn't about monsters, it's about people. It's about feeling trapped in your own life, feeling isolated, feeling like you're losing your grip on reality. In The Haunting of Hill House, which is one of my favorite shows, by the way, I cried pretty much the entire time, but it's still my favorite. The terror, though, isn't the house. It's The Haunting of Hill House, but the terror isn't the house. It's the main character's internal state. So we're following Nell and we're feeling her loneliness, her vulnerability, her need to belong somewhere. And that's what makes it unsettling because it feels real. It feels possible. Today, we have something called prestige horror. So you can see Shirley's legacy in that, like in Ari Aster's Hereditary. So in that, the house is just a container for the family's trauma. The house has moved to the middle of the American suburbs, and now we don't really need a ghost because we have a deteriorating mind. But as horror evolved, it began to lean on a very specific archetype, the final girl. Notice how it's never the final boy, okay? For a long time, the final girl was a formula, the pure girl who survives the slasher. But in the hands of female creators, that trope shifted. It stopped being about purity and it started being about resilience. And this is where horror moves toward trauma and psychology. Female writers and directors started asking, what happens after the credits roll? They shifted the focus from the scare to the survival. In modern horror driven by women, the genre has become a language for processing mental health, and the monster is often just a placeholder for PTSD or grief. They turn the final girl from a victim into a warrior who has survived the unthinkable. And I like that. And that's a pattern that you start to see. Across generations, women in horror aren't just trying to scare you, they're trying to say something, so pay attention. And that becomes even more clear when you look at modern creators like Jennifer Kent. Before The Babadook, Jennifer worked in film, but she struggled to get projects made. And when she finally did, she created a film that on the surface looks like a traditional horror story: a mother, a child, a monster. But that's not really what it is. It's about grief. It's about what happens after loss. It's about the parts of motherhood that people don't talk about: exhaustion, resentment, isolation. The monster isn't just a creature. Instead, it's a manifestation of everything the main character is trying to suppress. And then there's Lily Amirpour. Her path is completely different. Also, I apologize. Again, I don't know if I pronounced her name correctly. She's Iranian American, and her work blends cultures, styles, and expectations in a way that doesn't fit neatly into just one category. Her film, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, is technically a vampire story, but it's quiet, it's minimal, it's focused on loneliness, on identity, and on power. And what's interesting is that the female vampire in her story isn't just a monster. She's selective. She targets men who are harmful, which shifts the dynamic, turns the traditional fear on its head. And this is where we get into one of the most misunderstood geniuses in modern horror, Diablo Cody. In 2009, we get a writer who took all these highbrow concepts and just dipped them in some neon pink glitter with a bunch of blood. So Radcliffe was writing about the terror of the locked room. Cody's writing is about the terror of being a teenage girl in a world that is obsessed with your body, but has no interest in your soul. When she wrote Jennifer's Body, she wasn't just making a slasher movie. She was writing a script that she famously said was for the girls. Okay? And yet it was marketed to boys as a sexy slasher. And most people didn't get it at the time, but I did. And you bet your ass I made everyone watch it. God, I loved that movie. I brought it to school. I got it allowed to be watched in class. Anyway, she took the classic trope of the monstrous woman and flipped it around. In her world, Jennifer isn't just a demon. She's a victim of male violence who decides to eat the men who look at her like a piece of meat. It's a literal manifestation of female rage and the toxic sandbox love of high school friendships that Shirley Jackson would have recognized in a heartbeat. But what's really interesting is how Cody's work was received. Much like Radcliffe, whose fame led to rumors of insanity, Cody faced an immediate backlash. Like I said, the movie was marketed to boys as this sexy thriller slasher. So when it turned out to be a feminist satire about bodily autonomy, the critics savaged it. Much like they did with the Barbie movie, okay? It took a decade and the Me Too movement for the world to kind of catch up to what Cody was doing. Today, Jennifer's Body is a feminist cult classic, and it proved that horror doesn't have to be quote unquote respectable to be profound. Cody shows us that being a teenage girl is its own kind of hell, and sometimes the only way to survive it is to become the monster yourself. And when you step back and you look at all of this together, something becomes really clear, right? Women didn't just help build horror, they changed what horror is. They moved it from external fear to internal fear, from monsters to meaning. And a lot of that comes from the fact that historically, women didn't always have the ability to openly express what they were feeling. So they found another way. They used horror. And that's why you see recurring themes like the body as something that changes without your control, or the home as something that isn't safe, or even the mind as something that can turn against you. You know, these aren't random things. They're reflections. And for a long time, this wasn't fully recognized. But that is finally starting to change. Books like Monster She Wrote by Lisa Kroger and Melanie R. Anderson go back and document the long history of women in horror. And The Lady and Her Monsters by Roseanne Montijo takes a closer look at Mary Shelley's life and the science that influenced her work. There's a growing effort to correct the narrative, to show that women weren't just present, they were foundational. So when we talk about horror now, we're not just talking about something meant to scare us. We are talking about a genre that has been shaped over and over again by women trying to make sense of our world, trying to express things that they weren't always allowed to say directly. And I think that's what makes it so powerful. And I think that's why I like horror so much. And I didn't even realize it. Growing up, I was very scared of horror. Like I said, a freaking Disney Channel movie made me so scared for a month. It was so bad. I don't know if I mentioned this in another episode. I couldn't even watch regular TV during the month of October or even the month of January because horror movies used to always come out in January. But in October and January, I stuck to only watching PBS or the Animal Planet because those were the only channels that didn't have scary commercials. And then later they did start to have scary things. Like the Animal Planet had something about haunted animals. Oh, I couldn't do it. And I don't know what changed, but something finally clicked with me that I love horror. I don't know. Now I love it. Like The Strangers, one of my favorite movies. Sinister, ugh, so good. And I like all the ones that don't rely on the jump scares. The movie Hush, highly underrated. I don't know. There's a million more. I don't know. Like I said, I love Jennifer's Body. That's one of my favorites as well. But anyway, so as we close out this episode and as we close out Women's History Month, maybe we should stop thinking of horror as just entertainment and start paying attention to what it's actually saying, specifically what women are saying. Because this is just a little side note for all you bros who live and die for American Psycho. I don't know if you know this, but that was co-written by Mary Herron, a woman. And guess what it's about, since a lot of people can't seem to understand the obvious? It's poking fun at corporate culture and, say it with me, toxic masculinity, which I just think is so funny because if you guys didn't watch The Manosphere on Netflix, very interesting, very cringy. But a lot of those guys in The Manosphere, they reference Patrick Bateman from American Psycho as the idealized male role model when he's literally a satirical warning. Oh, bless their hearts. If you enjoyed this episode, I would love to hear from you. What is a horror story, book, movie, anything that actually stuck with you? Maybe you're like me who understood and appreciated Jennifer's Body ahead of its time. I would love to hear more about those types of books or movies or whatever. You can tag me on Instagram at indistinct.pod or at Eliza Hollister. Send me a message or share this episode with someone who loves this kind of creepy deep dive information. And if you haven't already, don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps me so much more than I think anybody can imagine. I'm literally begging. Please share, please comment, please review. It costs you $0, but it helps me not $1,000,000, but it helps me a million lots. I don't know. New episodes of Indistinct Chatter are available every Tuesday wherever you listen to podcasts. So we will chat next Tuesday. I love ya. Love you. Bye.